What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the show. Today, I'm going to do something a little different. Instead of talking about a specific subject, I'm actually going to go over, or rather, a specific history, I should say. I'm going to go over how I do my research to prepare for the shows. And total transparency, I was actually doing a lot of this stuff, actually all of this stuff before I even started the show. I would get obsessed with the topic and then I would start reading. Usually it came from something like I would hear a historian on YouTube say something that I thought to be ridiculous or bombastic or just stupid. And I could not help myself. I had to go back and start doing a bunch of research in order to disprove him, even though obviously he's not aware of my existence. And at the end of the day, I really wasn't able to like knock on his door and tell him why he was wrong or she was wrong. So I sort of came up with this methodology. Most of it, if not all of it, is based on my experience going to school at Columbia University between, 2015 to 2017. But let's back up a little. I'm going to start from the beginning and sort of walk you through this narrative, the story, and then I'll explain sort of the tools of the trade. The other thing that I want to do as well is a lot of you guys have been asking, and I say guys because according to the statistics, it's like 99.999% dudes watching the channel, which is hilarious and awesome. And it's great. One of the things I'm going to do is, again, some of you have asked or requested the titles of the books that I use to do my research, so I'll give you some of those. So yeah, with that said, let's just dive right in. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society podcast. Okay, so some context here. I talked a little bit about this in my introductory video, if you go back, but just to sort of catch all of you up, I was a terrible student. Looking back, it's a miracle that I graduated high school. If I was given homework that I physically had to hand in, I would do it. But if I had to read a book or read a textbook or study for an exam, never, ever. I don't think I read a single book in high school, probably not in middle school. Again, I do not know how I graduated. When I finished, I had a 2.7 GPA. And I got a 19 on my ACT score. It was a horror show. So what's fascinating though is despite my failures or my lack of even motivation as a student when I was in my teens, after I got out of the Army, I was a straight A student, more or less, pretty close. And I eventually got into Columbia University somehow. Obviously, Columbia has tons of its own issues, but they do know how to teach their students how to study history. At least that was my experience. I disagreed vehemently with so much of the material they were putting out, but if anything, it gave me the skill set to argue against bad ideas. And kudos where kudos is due. I would say the vast majority of my professors actually wanted me or motivated me or told me to push back against them. So anytime we would go write a paper or do an exam, they would say all the time, almost universally, hey, whatever ideas I put out, I want you to disagree with them. I want you to go out and do your own research and prove me wrong. And so I got into this habit over the course of multiple years of taking ideas or questions or thoughts and pushing back against them. And that's kind of where all of this came from. But one of the things I had to do in school, my reading skills, like how quickly I could read, and also my reading comprehension were horrific prior to college. And so all of a sudden I found myself, between the ages of 14 to 24, I can almost say with 100% certainty, I do not think I cracked a single book and finished it from front to back once. I mean, I may have like picked up a book and read the first couple chapters and I kind of just stopped. And then all of a sudden I get to school and I was having to read anywhere from 2 to 5 books a week. And so it was just like information overload. I couldn't read quick enough. And obviously, as I'm trying to speed read all this stuff, which I'm not very good at all, the reading comprehension just wasn't there. So I had to come up with ways and strategies and a new approach in order to get through school. And so this is my framework. I think it works really well for me, and I want to sort of pass it on to you guys. Hopefully you can get something out of it. And again, this is literally what I do to prepare for all my shows, to be able to talk about a subject that might be really intricate and really detailed for 20 or 30 minutes or longer. The first thing you're going to do in this process is obviously you're going to pick a topic, a history, maybe an individual, right? Event that's maybe like a battle or something. But instead of picking up a biography on that individual, instead of picking up a book specifically about that battle, what I do, what you should do, in my opinion, is go find a book, and you can use Goodreads or Amazon.com. Find a book that is roughly 250 to 300 pages. So when I started doing my Robert Rogers stuff, I had like a general idea of who he was. And I'd obviously heard of the French Indian Wars, but if you asked me any questions about that conflict, I could not give you a single answer. So what I did was I needed to build, you sort of imagine this is like building a house, and you can't build the kitchen if there's no frame. So you have to build a frame for your house. And so you're going to do that by picking up a book like this. It's rough. This is 250 pages ish, give or take. And this one specifically is by Edward P. Hamilton. It's called The French and Indian Wars. It was written in the 70s, I believe. And it's just a brief overview with maps and just it just generally covers the war, why the war started, what led up to the war, who was involved in the war, the major figures, where it took place. And even though, obviously, if you're from the United States, you know where these areas are. But then within these areas, the actual theater of war they fought in, which would be Lake Champlain, Lake George, like I didn't know about them prior to investigating this stuff. And so getting into this and getting that overview built out that frame that I could start sort of building in the details. I could start building the kitchen and the electric and the plumbing and all that stuff. So the first thing I do is I start with a simple, easy to read book, 250, maybe 300 pages at most. What's going to happen is as you're reading this introductory book, the author is going to mention probably a variety of primary sources, but I guarantee there's one or two in particular that they're constantly going back to. The second thing you're going to do, let me back up a little bit. This is a personal thing, so just FYI. I typically, not always, like to pick books, the starter ones in the first step. I like to pick books that were written in the 90s or before. The issue that I have when I find books that are written after that is they're highly politicized, which is super frustrating. That's not to say you shouldn't. There's a really good book out there that you want to use as your starter that was written in the 2000s or 2010s. Fine, so be it. A good example of this would be Neil Pearce wrote a book called Children of Ash and Elm. It's, I think, in my opinion, the best book on Viking history. He goes into where the Vikings came from, their religion, what their economy was like. And then also, there's a through line of sort of A to B to Z of their history and lineage. And in that book, for reasons I will never understand, there's a whole section about gender fluidity. It makes no sense. I am not a Viking expert, but it just sounded completely ridiculous to me. And he was really stretching. My guess is there was some direction from the publisher or from the university. I don't know. But anyways, like I said, if you read books prior to 1995, you're more than likely not going to get that kind of stuff. That's my recommendation there. After you read this, you're going to jump into your primary sources. What are your primary sources? Primary sources are your eyewitness reports. These are absolutely critical when you are studying any history. When you are going into this and you've picked your topic and you go start reading all of your books and all your source and getting into your source material, you're really just a detective. And all this stuff is the evidence that you're trying to compile together to paint a clearer picture of what happened, what took place, who these individuals were that were at certain battles or whatever. And I remember being in college thinking to myself, like, oh my God, I should go be a cop because I'm just a detective. This is like my entire life is detective work. Primary sources, they can be very, very easy. I find it's funny. There's no middle ground. They're either really quick reads that you can get through in like 1 or 2 days. Robert Rogers' journal is a great example of this. It's a quick read. It's nice and short. Or your primary source is going to be like Herodotus, which is an enormous book, very complicated, highly detailed. And just by the way, going back 1 second, if you try to jump, some professors, some historians argue you should start with a primary source first. I find this to be problematic at best because when you're getting into the primary source, you are entering into what Tolkien referred to as a secondary world, more or less. Obviously, yes, it's true events. They're not fictitious. They did happen, but we are so far removed from all these histories, whether it was 17th century or 500 BCE, that you just don't know really anything. Like the world literally geographically looked radically different in some places, not all places, but cities that no longer exist, you're unaware of. People, events. Like if you try to read Herodotus with no framework, you're going to be instantaneously lost. It's much like if you were trying to read Lord of the Rings and you started instead of starting with The Hobbit, you started with the Two Towers, and you started like in the middle of the Two Towers. You don't know who Frodo is. You don't know who Gandalf is. You have no idea what the Ring of Power is or what its purpose is. You have no idea who Sauron is. They're talking about how they're going to Rohan. You don't know where Rohan is. You've never seen this map before. And history is very much the same. It's the same concept. It's the same idea. So you need to understand Middle Earth. You need to understand where Frodo came from and what his motivations are and his relationship with Bilbo before you can get to the Two Towers and Return of the King. So once you have that framework and you start into your primary source, you understand the world that this character or this individual is now occupying. And so it makes it much easier for your reading comprehension. As you're moving through your primary and secondary sources, you should really start to hone in on specific themes or questions that you want answers to. And this, for me, is the most exciting part. So I'll give you an example. One of the questions I had as I started the process of learning about Robert Rogers was, how did he go from being a frontiersman in his early 20s to an officer in the British Army? Because it just seems so radical to me. Like, did he have formal training? Was he in a militia? Did he learn how to do certain things from Native Americans? And so as I'm going through my source material, any mention or any sort of indication of like, hey, this is how I learned my craft, I stop, I highlight or underline. I might write like a little note in the margin and I put a little tab. Some people will tell you to like write note cards and have a whole filing system. I don't like to do that because I think it disrupts my entire process. If it works for you, great. But again, for me, I do like to underline. And again, I make a little note in the margin. And that way, when I'm going back and I want to remember something that I've maybe I forgot or remind myself, I can flip open the book and go back to that section. I have a rough idea of where it's at. And then I can find, where I tab the page and then it's underlined right there. Differences between primary and secondary sources. I know some of you who listen to this probably studied history in college, so you already know, but just for this is kind of for the layman as well. Imagine that you are at a party, you're having some beers with your boys, and one of the guys there was in the 101st and deployed to Iraq, and he's telling you war stories, experiences that he had during the war. That is a primary source. He is telling you specifically what he went through. Now, let's say in that same framework, he is telling you stories about how his grandfather fought in Vietnam and he was coming off the Huey and there were bullets flying everywhere and he got a Silver Star and was shot in the leg. That is a secondary source. So another good example of a secondary source is someone like Plutarch. Either he is reading materials that we no longer have today in order to write his biographies, or he is talking to individuals who knew the individual that went through, whatever it was that they went through. And so the best, your primary sources are your absolute best source material. And after that is your secondary source. And as you progress further and further away from that event, that's sort of when you have to really scrutinize what you're reading and who's writing it and why they're writing it. And you always are scrutinizing biases within the historical record. But as it progresses further and further out from the actual event, obviously, whether or not it's true or not becomes sort of problematic. Okay. So at this point, you've read your introductory book. You've read maybe one or two primary or secondary sources. And now what you're going to go do is you're going to go find a subject matter expert on the topic at hand. So a good example of this is if you're studying Sparta, it's a great idea to go find a book written by a guy named Paul Cartledge. He, I would say, is the bee's knees, the guy when it comes to Spartan history. The other thing you should be doing as well throughout this entire process from beginning to end is going online and looking for lectures on YouTube, podcasts that talk about this same history. Even if it's a sort of gloss over the history, for me at least, it helps reinforce everything that I'm doing. So, for example, when I was doing the Robert Rogers stuff, I would just go into YouTube and look up any professor that gave a lecture about the French and Indian War as I was reading my first book. And listening to it and reading it just helps absorb the material even more. And when you find your subject matter expert, very, very often they always post their lectures on YouTube. It's kind of hilarious. Kids go and spend thousands and thousands of dollars on an education, and you can literally get the same lecture for free online. It's fantastic. So I listen to a ton of lectures on the internet, as well as podcasts. Sometimes these authors will do interviews. Those are great too. So like I said, just the audio really helps me pick up all of the information. You want to read, I would say, somewhere in the ballpark of like 2 to 3 scholarly works on your subject. They're going to be much bigger books. So a good example of this is when I got into the scholarly work for Robert Rogers, I read this book. It's called A True Ranger, The Life and Many Wars of Major Robert Rogers. This is a super dense book. Unfortunately, they don't publish it anymore, so it's a bit expensive and hard to find, but it's absolutely incredible. The research this individual did is, the author's name is Gary Zaboli. He found newspaper clippings, diaries from other individuals that fought in the war, and just brings so much information and light to Robert Rogers and his career. Here it is right here. The other one I read was called Ranger's Raid. It was by a historian named Philip. I think it was Philip Thomas Tucker. I'll post a picture of that as well. And ideally, when you're doing the scholarly work portion of this, you want to find historians that disagree with one another on certain things. So you're getting a variety of different arguments or ideas, and these different sort of theses or thesi, I don't know what the plural of thesis is. You're getting to understand what they disagree with and where you can sort of wedge yourself in order to answer the questions that you have. And based on, once again, the primary source material as well as the scholarly work, you are definitely going to find the answers that you are looking for. Also, as you're doing your scholarly work, you may discover new primary sources or new secondary sources, and it's a really good idea to go track those down, find them, and then use them as well. So an example in Robert Rogers, as I was reading, I believe this book, the True Ranger book, there was an officer named John Stark. He was a ranger lieutenant underneath Robert Rogers, and his grandson, Caleb Stark, wrote a biography about his grandfather. So I went out and found that, and it gave me all kinds of really great details, and it was super illuminating in terms of how these individuals went from frontiersmen to guerrilla fighters during the French and Indian War. So that's the general process of how I go through these things. Again, just to lay this out really as clearly as possible, I start with an introductory book, and then I move to my primary sources, my secondary sources, and then I go on to do scholarly work. And by the time you get to the scholarly work, you should have a really good idea of the world that these individuals occupied. You know the major events, and now you're just kind of filling in the details. You're painting the house, you're installing the appliances, and you're really creating this robust knowledge of what's going on, and you can speak to and understand it. Obviously, this is a long process. If you are somebody who maybe you want to read more, but you haven't created that habit, there's a lot of great resources out there of how to create habits in your life. And honestly, doing this type of work is a lot like starting a workout regimen. My recommendation there is, again, if you're somebody who wants to get into this stuff and just doesn't know how, carve out 5, maybe 10 minutes a day. And for me, the best time of day to do this work is first thing in the morning. My brain is fresh. The kids are asleep. I have a cup of coffee, and I just can sit down and I can read. And it's just, for me, it's the best time to do it. I would start with, like I said, maybe 5, 10, 20 minutes. And then it's like working out. As you get those reps in, you can push it and push it and push it. Ideally, in a perfect world, you can carve out an hour a day. For me, I'm a really slow reader. In an hour, I can typically read somewhere between like 20 to 30 pages, depending on the book. That's enough for me that over the course of a month, I can do a ton of reading and I can get through all of my materials. So that's another thing to sort of consider as you're going through this. So like I said, I hope this helps you. I hope this gives you some idea of how to better understand history. Unfortunately, I'll sort of end on this. Let's say, like, there was one moment in my life where I was really interested in the history of George Washington. And I picked up, I think it was Ron Chernow wrote like 1,000-page biography on George Washington. And instead of going through the process that I just described, I picked up this book and I read through it. And it was, if you've ever read it or you haven't read it, it's incredibly dense. And I remember I finished the book and I kind of closed it and set it aside. And I realized, like, I did not really know anything about George Washington, despite the fact that I just read this enormous behemoth of a book. And it was super frustrating. And I was kind of wondering, thinking to myself, like, how do I not know anything about George Washington? I just read this huge, enormous book about his life. The reason for that is because, again, I'm not hitting the information from multiple vantage points over and over and over again. I didn't have the framework when I went into it. I didn't read the primary source material. I just went and tried to read this biography. So again, if you just want to read history for entertainment, by all means, like, go get the one book or the introductory book, read it, enjoy it, be done with it. But if you're someone who really wants to understand the history and really flesh it out and know it well and be able to recall a lot of the material 6 months from now and speak to it, the way to do it is the way that I've described in this episode. Start with your introductory book, go through your primary source material, and then dive into the scholarly work. For me, that's just the best way that I found to do this stuff. So anyways, with that said, I hope you guys got something out of this. And I promise I'm working on the Reconquest of Spain. I'm going through everything that I just described. And I promise I'm getting there. It's coming. So anyways, I'll see you guys soon. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society. Deuces.